place. Historic, old, big buildings with lots of history. There's this one artist that, for some of you in the room, you might be familiar with if you ever took art in high school. But the artist is named Rodin. Rodin was this amazing man who took stone and with his own hands carved the stone to look like things that he thought were important. And on one occasion, he took literally chisels and hammers and took a block of marble and literally chiseled it until the marble was so smooth and so clear, it looked like it was glowing. How could you do that with chisels? And then, not just chiseling the stone for no purpose, chiseling the stone so it would actually look like a human being. If you ever saw a piece of Rodin sculpture, you're literally looking at a stone that looks like an actual human being with all of the muscles and tendons, the exact same size as a human hand, the exact angles that a human body would be contorted at. Walking through his museum was amazing. I remember walking into one part of the museum, and in the center of the room was a famous Rodin sculpture. And the sculpture's name was The Kiss. It's a picture of a man, a husband, and his wife embracing. The wife is sitting on the man's legs, and her legs are gently falling off to the side. He's with his left hand holding the back of her neck, and with his right hand delicately touching her arm. There's nothing ferocious or even erotic about this moment. It's tender. It's beautiful. I stood there and I watched this sculpture, just amazed at its beauty, made out of marble, glowing, smooth, glassy. How could a human being capture the exact moment? For those of you who are married in the room, you know that moment. It's not erotic. It's not pornographic. It's love. You know that feeling. How could a sculptor create something with chisels and hammers just so elegantly and perfectly reflect the human emotion of love? I was captivated. There's something about art that does that. Seeing something evokes something in you. Seeing something raises emotions in you. What is that? Is that just a skillful artist mimicking life? Or maybe it's more deep than that. Could it be this? That what captures your attention reveals an important part of you? Could it be that what captures your attention reveals an important part of you? If that's true, then everything in your life and everyone in your life can be like a mirror. Because everything can capture your attention and everyone can capture your attention, and what you see in everything and in everyone might reveal something in you. Like the friend that you know, who keeps choosing his work over his kids. All of us have been that or know that person. You keep choosing work. Why? Well, everything that you see in another might reveal a tendency in your own life. Oh, I know why. Because like that guy, I'm obsessive and compulsive. I abdicate responsibility to others. I'm good at not upholding my responsibilities for other priorities. Why does the girl, you know that girl, the girl who always chooses the bad guy? You ever know that girl? We've been there, right? We have been this girl at some times. Why do I keep choosing the wrong person? I just seem to keep gravitating It's like the wrong person. Why is that? Because maybe, just maybe, we see in the other person that something that's true about ourselves. Or what about that harsh person? You know what I'm talking about. That person that's always critical. Always has something negative to say about everybody else. Maybe, just maybe, what they see and criticize in others is actually the very things that they detest about themselves. See, don't you see that what captures your attention reveals important parts of you? In the same way that looking at a Rodin sculpture captures your attention, for me, it revealed a part of me which is true, that love is important to me. Real love is important to me. You know, the reality is that most times when we criticize others, it's a reflection of the things that we have a hard time accepting about ourselves. Most criticisms are that way. If you've ever criticized your parent because they should have been different, you've ever criticized your friend because they should have chose different, you ever criticized your boss because they should have acted different, most often those criticisms have a lot to do with them and are also a reflection of you. We criticize most harshly the things that we have a hard time accepting about ourselves. See, because the reality is that what captures your attention reveals an important part of you. And now in this text, Solomon, his attention has been captured. He's going to see things in 4 different areas of life. He's going to see things in the news. He's going to see things at work. He's going to see things in relationships. And he's going to see things in leadership. And what he sees might just reveal some of the things in his own life that he's wrestling with. And I'm wondering if you might see what he sees, you might also see something in you. That's what I'm hoping will happen as you read this text. 4 things Solomon sees. First, in the news, verses 1 through 3. Again, I looked and saw all the oppression, this is chapter 4, that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of the oppressors. They have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who's never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. Solomon is reading the news, just like you and I. We turn on the television and we watch the news, or if you're old, you read the paper. He's looking at the news. He's scrolling through his Twitter feed. He's scrolling through Snapchat. He's learning what's happening. And sure enough, he sees corruption and oppression. The powerful overcome the powerless. And it's filling his news feed, so to speak. And he's thinking about all those unborn children, and he's going, better for them to not have to live and go through all this madness than all those kids who have been born and are having to deal with this madness. That's his conclusion. But you know, his news is not that much different from our news. If you turned on the television today, you would see that 14 million people in the Sudan are under war. Did you know that? 14 million people are at war. You would see in the news today that in Syria, there's such an economic crisis in Syria because of 10 years of war. There are 10 million people who are now displaced in Syria. These are families. These are parents with kids trying to figure out how to live. Or what about Yemen in the news? They were in the news recently. Their government doesn't care about them. The Yemenese government cares about themselves and getting rich, and so their system is collapsing, and 20 million people are being affected by the economic collapse in Yemen. And of course, you all know about what's happening in Ukraine, right? Just this week, now 8 million people have been officially displaced in Ukraine, having to flee their homes. These are, families just trying to make a buck and do right by their kids, and they can't live where they live because where they live is where war is happening. We're looking at the news and we're seeing the powerless affected by the powerful. We're seeing corruption. We're seeing economic collapse. And even here on our own U.S. soil, just this week, the U.S. government told us that they just found 50 Native American boarding school burial sites. For those of you who understand what that means, as I do, for someone that lived in Canada, often these are mass graves where Native children who were taken from their families during a dark period in American history were put into boarding schools and not allowed to speak their own languages and not allowed to grow up with their parents. Many of these children were abused. That's not hearsay, that's documented, and were buried without a casket or a stone to remember their name. We just found 50 on our soil. You see, in the news, we see the powerless being affected by the powerful. In the news, we see corruption and pain and suffering. And this is not God's heart. I think we could all agree with that. Is this God's heart?
No.
Clearly not. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 17 speaks about God's heart. God will say, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. That's God's heart. Jesus will uphold this. He'll say in Luke chapter 4, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me because He's anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for captives and release from darkness for prisoners. He gives us a clear picture of what it means to love the poor. And Paul in the New Testament, when he's writing to the churches, on many occasions says to care for the poor, but in Galatians chapter 6 verse 2 gives the Galatian church their mandate. He says this, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. You see, it's clear in Scripture that corruption and pain and tragedy, which comes from poverty and economic collapse and unjust practices of the powerful, none of that is God's heart. So in verse 1, when Solomon says, so again I considered all the oppression that continuously happens on the earth, and this is what I saw, the oppressed in tears, no one was comforting them, no one delivers them from the power of their oppressors. That's the NET translation. He's saying, I'm seeing all this stuff happening and there's no comfort and there's no help. So he sees this lesson. Where comfort lacks, oppression abounds. Where comfort lacks, oppression abounds. You know, right here in our city on Motel Drive, there are many girls, we know this is well documented, being trafficked out of our hotels. Correct or incorrect? Correct. We all know this to be true. But what can any of us do? This is a known practice. These girls are moved from here to Sacramento, down to LA, and then back to Fresno. They're moved around and around and around through our motel systems. And no one, seemingly no one, there to provide the comfort that they need. Well, there's one organization just north of us. We're thankful. We're thankful for them. We're thankful for the work of the Contreras family. We're thankful for them. Praise God that there's someone. But would you say that there's a macro solution to a macro problem for trafficking in Fresno? Not yet. And so where comfort lacks, oppression abounds. You see, if people don't step in and step up, injustice will. That's how it happens. Where comfort lacks, oppression abounds. This also happens at the level of our families. You ever had a kid in your family with one of your own children that you just have a special awareness that if I don't step into this child's life, they will become crazy. They will become a crazy person. I have that in my family. One of my kids, I'm like, no, I got my eye on you, child. I got my eye on you, child. Because if I don't step in and step up when it matters, you're going to make some bad choices. You're going to learn to make some bad choices. Do you have someone like that in your family? Where you go, if I don't provide comfort, something bad's going to happen. You see, because where comfort lacks, oppression abounds. It happens at the level of neighbors. When I have a neighbor, as we do down the street, who loves to blare their music at about 1 a.m. in the morning, partying hard, spinning donuts. If I just go, you know what, I'm tired, I'm not going to deal with this, I'm not going to call it in, just whatever. Will it continue happening or not happen? It'll continue. You see, because where comfort, where there's the absence of comfort, oppression abounds. If I don't step in and step up, it just continues. You see? And this is what Solomon sees. Where there's a lack of comfort, oppression abounds. The second thing Solomon sees is at work, verses 4 through 8. And I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one another, one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless. Havel, the chasing after the wind. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than 2 handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil. Yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is Havel, a miserable business. He reflects at the beginning of this as he's looking at the workplace. And he goes like, all toil and achievement spring from one another's envy of the other. Everything that workers do is happening because workers are doing it out of envy for someone else in their workplace. Let me explain. He identifies 2 types of workers. And you have had these workers in your, if you're working at Walmart or you're working in some office somewhere, you know these 2 workers. And you might be one of these 2 workers. More than likely, you have been or currently are or don't want to be. The first type of worker is verse 5. We call it the lazy worker. Anybody know a lazy worker? Oh my gosh. They are everywhere. The lazy worker doesn't want to step up. The lazy worker wants to do bare minimum. The lazy worker wants to get credit for the stuff that other people did. The lazy worker doesn't step up or step in. He says, Solomon says, fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. This is the worker with his hands folded. Oh, so annoying. The second kind of worker he talks about is in verse 8. I'll call it the lonely workaholic. He says, this man, there was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother, no end to his toil. Yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling? He asked. And why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This is the lonely workaholic. This is the guy that is always at work. He's always putting in another hour. He's not really connected to his friends or family. I know some of those folks too. You? What Solomon is reflecting on is that both the lazy worker and the lonely workaholic are both motivated by envy. Because how many of you have ever kind of like been at work and you're like, man, like I kind of want van life. I want to be like a self-made millionaire. So I can just kind of like do what I want to do. Right? And so you go in your Instagram feed and type in van life. And there are all these seemingly happy people who are living their best life with like remote work. You know what I'm talking about, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what's driving your laziness? Envy. You just want what seemingly other people have because it seems really awesome. I want to do the least that I can do to get the most that I can get to live the life that I most want to have. Well, the same is true for the lonely workaholic. But see, the lonely workaholic is looking at all those other people who have more money, more stuff, more possessions, a little bit nicer, they're working for a better wage. They too are motivated by envy. The lazy worker and the lonely workaholic are both motivated by envy. Solomon goes, this is smoke, man. The lazy worker is just chasing after something that won't satisfy, and the lonely workaholic is just chasing for something that won't satisfy. I read an article recently by a columnist named Ellen Goodman, and I couldn't help but think they described the lonely workaholic. Ellen writes this: Boston. He worked himself to death, finally and precisely at 3 a.m. Sunday. The obituary didn't say that, of course. It said that he died of a coronary thrombosis. I think that's what it was. But every one of his friends and acquaintances knew it instantly. He was a perfect type A workaholic. A classic, they said to each other, and shook their heads. And thought for 5 or 10 minutes about the way they lived. This man, who worked himself to death finally and precisely at 3 a.m. on Sunday, on his day off, was 51 years old. And he was a vice president. He was, however, one of the 6 vice presidents and one of 3 who might conceivably, if the president died or retired soon enough, have moved to the top spot. Phil knew that. He worked 6 days a week. 5 of them until 8 or 9 at night, during a time when his own company had begun a 4-day week for everyone but the executives. He worked like the important people. He had no outside extracurricular interests, unless, of course, you think about the monthly golf game that way. To Phil, it was work. He always ate egg salad sandwiches at his desk. He was, of course, overweight by 20, 25 pounds. He thought it was okay, though, because he didn't smoke. On Saturdays, Phil wore a sports jacket to the office instead of a suit because it was the weekend. He had a lot of people working for him, maybe 60. And most of them liked him most of the time. 3 of them will be seriously considered for his job. The obituary didn't mention that. But it did list his survivors quite accurately. He is survived by his wife, Helen, 48 years old, a good woman of no particular marketable skills, who worked in an office before marrying and mothering. She had, according to her daughters, given up trying to compete with his work years ago when the children were small. A company friend said, "I know how much you will miss him." And she answered, "I already have." Missing him all these years, she must have given up part of herself, which had cared too much for the man. She would be well taken care of. His dearly beloved, eldest of the dearly beloved children, is a hardworking executive in a manufacturing firm down south. In the day and a half before the funeral, he went around the neighborhood researching his father, asking the neighbors what he was like. They were embarrassed. His second child was a girl who was 24 and newly married. She lives near her mother and they are close, but whenever she was alone with her father in a car driving somewhere, they had nothing to say to each other. The youngest is 20, a boy, a high school graduate who spent the last couple years, like a lot of his friends, doing enough odd jobs to stay up on things. He was the one who tried to grab at his father and tried to mean enough to him to keep the man at home. He was his father's favorite. Over the last 2 years, Phil stayed up nights worrying about that boy. The boy once said, "My father and I only bored here." At the funeral, the 60-year-old company president told the 48-year-old widow that the 51-year-old deceased had meant so much to the company and would be missed and would be hard to replace. The widow didn't look him in the eye. She was afraid he would read her bitterness, and after all, she would need him to straighten out the finances, the stock options, and all of that. Phil was overweight and nervous and worked too hard. If he wasn't at the office, he was worried about it. Phil was a type A, a heart attack natural. You could have picked him out of a crowd from a lineup in a minute. So when he finally worked himself to death at precisely 3 a.m. Sunday, no one was really surprised. By 5 p.m., the Sunday of the funeral, the company president had began, discreetly of course, with care and taste, to make inquiries about his replacement. One of 3 men. He asked around, "Who's been working the hardest?" It's a good picture of the lonely workaholic. Solomon says in this text, verse 8, this is the TEV translation, "For whom is he working so hard and denying himself any pleasure?" And then he says, "This is useless, Havel, too, and a miserable way to live." The lonely workaholic and the lazy worker are both envious in their approach towards work. They're working in such a way as to get the admiration of someone else. Solomon rejects them both. And in verse 6, he says this, "It is better to have only a little with peace of mind than to be busy all the time with both hands trying to catch the wind." That's the Good News translation. So what's better than envying the lonely workaholic or the lazy worker is to work with peaceful contentedness. Being a contented worker. That's what Solomon would recommend. Be a contented worker. Peaceful contentedness. Author William P. Brown says this, "As toil can be all-consuming, so idleness can be self-cannibalizing." And both of those things are true. See the lesson that Solomon sees, this, that discontented work starts where envy begins. Discontented work starts where envy begins. You will start hating your job and your life if you are chasing someone else's version of what good work looks like. Whether it's on the lazy side or the workaholic side, it's the same thing. Discontented work starts where envy begins. The third thing Solomon sees is in the field of relationships. He's thinking about human beings in their relatedness. He's thinking about our relationships, like the relationships even that we have in this room, or maybe the relationship that you have with the person you came with today. Verse 9. "Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor." I'd summarize it this way to say, togetherness maximizes impact. That would be what Solomon sees. Togetherness maximizes impact. This is societally true. Marriage is actually a really good thing financially, actually. It's good if you marry one person and stay with them the rest of your life. Social science and psychology and even economics teaches us this. But that didn't come from those fields. This is God's idea. God knew it was better for human beings to be together. Even in our Genesis, when you think of tribal cultures, hunter-gatherer types, are they out there trying to survive on their own? Yes or no? No. They are together. Because togetherness maximizes impact. Verse 10. And then he says, if either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. I might summarize it to say this: togetherness minimizes failure. Togetherness maximizes impact, but it also minimizes failure. And so by verse 11, Solomon says, also, if two lie down together, well, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though he may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. So I might say togetherness mobilizes resources. Togetherness mobilizes resources. This is particularly true of the church. This family that God is assembling together mobilizes resources so we can point them together in the same direction and do cool stuff in Jesus' name. Solomon, reflecting on relationships, well, I see that togetherness maximizes impact, and togetherness minimizes failure, and togetherness mobilizes resources. See the lesson that Solomon sees. Togetherness makes progress possible. Togetherness makes progress possible. That's why it's really important for you to think about who your friends are. It's really important. That's where progress happens in your life, in the life of your family. It's really important to think about this church and whether or not you're really together with people here. Because togetherness makes progress possible. Don't just stay on the fringe. Come into the center. Be a part. Know everybody's name. Togetherness makes progress possible. I've observed, and maybe you have too, that particularly for men, when a young guy meets a girl that's really solid, they will often get straight. That girl will often help kind of straighten out some of those creases and kinks. I'm not talking about a dysfunctional guy or a dysfunctional girl. That's a whole other category. I'm talking about a person who's acting like a little young guy. Just hasn't really grown up yet. That's his head on straight though. Sometimes that guy just needs a really solid girl. Right? Because togetherness makes progress possible. And this is true for our church friends. If you're here today, and you are, thankfully, know that this is a place for togetherness. You don't have to live on the fringe here. You can text anybody here. If someone doesn't know your name, introduce yourself. If you don't know someone's name, introduce yourself. Treat this place as a place of togetherness. That's what makes progress possible. The fourth thing Solomon sees in leadership, verses 13 through 16. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. In other words, he's saying just because you're older doesn't make you wiser. You know that old saying, with gray hair comes wisdom? Solomon would say, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Age doesn't inevitably guarantee wisdom. I have shared the golf course with many older guys than me who acted like children. I have worked for some of those older guys with gray hair, but they think and act like children. You have too, haven't you? Gray hair inevitably doesn't mean you're wiser and better. Oh, but if you think that means younger is better, just keep reading this text. Verse 14. The youth may have come from prison to kingship, or may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. Oh, so it's looking pretty good for the youth, right? He steps up and steps in. He's a rag to riches kind of story. This is a good story. Young guy takes the older guy's job. He's raising up. Everything's looking pretty good. Verse 16. But there was no end to all the people who were before him. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless. Chasing after the man. Well, see, the young guy gets replaced too. You see? Just because you're old doesn't mean you're wiser. Just because you're young doesn't mean you'll do it better. This is like in every church, the youth pastor always thinks they can do the senior pastor's job better, right? Have you ever been in multiple churches? This is like a common thing. Oh, if I were in leadership. Oh, really? What would you do then? So we have this tendency to believe that just because I'm my age, that makes me more qualified than that person who's younger. And if you're younger, you believe that just because I'm younger, that means that I can do it better. And Solomon is reflecting on leadership, and he's learning a lesson. This is the lesson, that past success is no guarantee for future success. Just because you were successful once doesn't mean that will make you successful again. Just because you have something on your resume last year doesn't mean that the next thing is going to be better than the last thing.
Amen.
And just because you think that you're young and you could do your leader's job better than them doesn't mean that that's actually true. It's just something you believe. And even if you did do your successor's job better, people will follow you. Isn't that great? Guess what? One day someone will replace you. Past success is no guarantee for future success. 4 lessons. 4 lessons Solomon sees, seeing the news and seeing the workplace and seeing relationships and seeing leaderships. Here they are. Where comfort lacks, oppression abounds. Discontented work starts where envy begins. Togetherness makes progress possible. And past success is no guarantee for future success. Seeing lessons like the ones that Solomon is seeing is like seeing art. Seeing these lessons is also revealing something that's important to you. For example, where comfort lacks and oppression abounds. Where do you see a need in your life right now that you can meet? Where comfort lacks, oppression abounds. So where do you see a need that you can meet? Ask yourself that question. Or this, discontented work starts where envy begins. Let me ask you, what do you see in your work-life balance right now? What do you see in your work-life balance right now? Or what about this? Togetherness makes progress possible. Let me ask you, what do you see that needs more of your time? Sorry, who do you see that needs more of your time? Who do you see that needs more of your time? Or lastly, this. Past success is no guarantee of future success. So let me ask you, what's the next risk you see God asking you to take? What's the next risk you see God asking you to take? You see, because Solomon sees a lesson, in those lessons we can see something for us. Where do you see a need you can meet? Where do you see your work-life balance right now? Who do you see that needs more of your time? And what's the next risk you see God asking you to take? I was recently in Yosemite National Park doing something that I really love doing, which is rock climbing. And we try to climb as much as possible, particularly during this season when it's not too hot yet and the bugs aren't crazy. And in Yosemite, we went to this climb called Claude's Delight. It's in the valley, Yosemite Valley, kind of the back end of the valley. You look up this massive wall stretching 3,000 feet to the sky, and around the corner is this tiny, seemingly insignificant blank face. But on the right-hand side of this tiny, seemingly blank face, there's this one crack. And this one crack just stretches up into the sky. Half of it is filled with moss and it's deeply forested, but it's a hidden delight in the middle of the forest. Why don't we climb that, I thought. So everybody got excited. I didn't really know if we could do it. In fact, I didn't even know the grade, the difficulty of the climb before I attempted. Heidi just said, "You could probably do that." And that was enough for me. You know, I put my hands in that crack, I put my feet in that crack, and started to move up this crack, placing gear, and it was pretty tough, tougher than I'm used to. And I couldn't help but thinking about the sermon that I would preach the next day, where past success is no guarantee of future success. And I kept thinking to myself, oh, I hope that wasn't for me. I hope that wasn't for me. As I got a little bit higher, I got to a part where I really got stuck. I was on a kind of an overhanging crack, and I stuck my hands into this overhanging crack where there was this bulge, and I couldn't get another piece of protection high enough to protect the move. It was going to take some energy and effort, and my hands were wearing out. I yelled down to my belayer who was hiding. I said, "Heidi, I think I'm going to fall right here. Watch me." She said, "I've got you." And I couldn't help think about the sermon that I was going to preach the next day, where I said togetherness makes progress possible. I thought, oh, I hope that one is for me. I hope she catches me if I fall on this climb. I didn't fall, but I paused and continued to climb. I got up a little higher on this climb, and there was this weird section of the climb where this oak tree was literally growing horizontally out of the rock. Very weird. Imagine just seeing a blank vertical rock face, granite, with a horizontal tree growing out of it. That's kind of cool. It was like I grabbed this tree, bear hugged it, It's a nice big anchor in the middle of this oasis of granite. So I grabbed this tree and I got a couple slings, that's pieces of webbing or rope, and I wrapped it around this tree and put a carabiner on it and clipped my rope into this carabiner. The tree surely would hold me, and then great, I'm feeling really good about this. And so I began to climb past the tree until I looked down at my arms and they were covered in red ants. The tree that I was bear hugging was covered in ants. So with one hand in the rock and one foot cammed into the crack, I'm doing this and then switching and doing this and then finding a way to do this and getting these. And that was all I could think of is I wish Heidi was the one that was climbing and not me. And I couldn't help but thinking about the sermon that I would preach the next day, where discontented work starts where envy begins. And I was discontented, but I kept climbing. I remember getting up to the top of that crack, and at the very top of the crack is the last few moves, and there's this overhanging arch trending left, and you would have to put your hands inside of this overhanging arch and on slippery feet move left, where the earth was below you, far down below. And I was scared. I won't lie. Been a while since I've done a hard climb at that level. This is going to be some effort, and this is going to hurt if I fall. And then Heidi from down below couldn't see me because she was far down below and the trees were far below where I was, yelled up at just the right moment, "You've got this! Go for it!" And I couldn't help but think about the sermon that I was going to preach the next day, where comfort lacks, oppression abounds. And in this case, there was all comfort, and so I felt less oppressed. You follow me? So let me ask you, but seriously, let me ask you, where do you see a need that you can meet? What do you see in your work-life balance right now? Who needs some of your time right now? And what's the next risk you see God asking you to take? If you answered those questions, or at least one of those questions, you'd be walking in wisdom. Let's pray. Lord God, I pray for each and every soul in this room. I pray for your wisdom in each of these areas. Thank you for speaking to us from your word. In Jesus' name, amen.